Hi, everybody. Welcome to Education for Flourishing, Pursuing Purpose in the Professions. This webinar is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a national forum housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. It serves scholars and practitioners across disciplines, considering how best to cultivate character in pre-professional and professional education. The initiative is funded through a generous grant from the Kern Family Foundation. I am Suzanne Shanahan, and I direct the Center for Social Concerns. I'm also the host for this series. At any point during this program, you can submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will turn to those audience questions around 12:40. Be assured there is a backstage team that will address any technical difficulties that will arrive. And with that, I'm thrilled to bits to introduce physician scientist Stephen Trzeciak to discuss kindness, compassion, and medicine. Dr. Trzeciak is a physician scientist, or as I've heard him describe himself, a research nerd who is also a doctor. His mission in life is to increase human compassion and kindness globally through science. He is currently Chief of Medicine at Cooper University Healthcare and Professor and Chair of Medicine at Cooper Medical College in Camden, New Jersey. Dr. Trzeciak is a practicing intensivist, someone who specializes in intensive care medicine, the kind of doctor you hope you never see. He is also a clinical researcher with more than 120 publications in the scientific literature. His scientific program has been supported by research grants from the National Institutes of Health, and he's currently serving as principal investigator. He is co-author of 2 books, Compassionomics, The Revolutionary Scientific Evidence That Caring Makes a Difference, and Wonder Drug, 7 scientifically proven ways that serving others is the best medicine for yourself. And for the local audience, Stephen is a Notre Dame alum and frequently lectures with the compassionate care minor here on campus. Fun fact, he likes cute, wacky dog photos. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's an honor to be here. I know all the tremendous work you all do in the Center for Social Concerns, and so that makes it really meaningful for me. I'm grateful for the invitation.
Great. So I'm excited to talk about your work in kindness and compassion, really hoping to have a broad, open-ended conversation, which I hope at some point will turn to both pre-professional and medical education. So maybe you could just get us rolling with a bit of context of what got you started in this line of work? Why thinking about compassion? Was there some event, something that sparked your interest?
Sure. So the first thing that I should say is that I was not in the market, so to speak, for any sort of change in trajectory of my research program. So I'm an intensivist, a specialist in intensive care medicine. My area of research was resuscitation science. So my colleagues and I, we were trying to identify the best oxygen level in the blood to protect against permanent brain damage after resuscitation from cardiac arrest. And now I study the science of compassion and serving others. And so really what changed everything for me was an unexpected question, a question from a 12-year-old. And the 12-year-old was my son. And one evening he asked me a question. He said, "Dad, I know you give a lot of talks in your research. I have to give a talk for my class at school. Could you help me prepare mine?" And I thought, this is going to be an amazing father-son bonding opportunity. Little did I know what was in store for me. And so he pulled out a sheet of paper from his backpack and laid it down on my desk. And on that sheet of paper was the topic for his talk at school. And the question was this: what is the most pressing problem of our time? 7th grade.
Wow.
So I don't know what you were doing, Suzanne, in 7th grade. I was not
dealing with that.
I was not doing what is the most pressing problem of our time. So in a conversation that spanned a few evenings, what we came to was that there's no such thing, right? There's no one single most pressing problem of our time. the question is, what is the most pressing problem of our time for you through your lens of experience in your little corner of the world or your scope of influence? What's the most pressing problem of our time in that space? And I knew what I was working on was important, if you happen to have that medical condition. But did I really believe it was the most pressing problem of our time? I mean, it was giving me publications on my CV and grants from funding sources, but that's what set me off in this really a period of introspection. I had to find it, and so that's what started it all.
So in that conversation with your 7th grade son, did you come to compassion at that time, or was this really an evolution? And that's a fairly significant pivot, right? You describe a very technical, critical health issue, and transitioning to something that, dare I say, has a broader scope, much more perhaps interdisciplinary approach. So did you come to it then, or was this a real evolution over time?
So like many things, and this is really where the science meets the personal for me. But like many things in life, major changes in trajectory or pivots happen in moments of crisis. And so the reality, even though I had my poker face glued on tight, after 20 years of working in the ICU, and oftentimes we meet people and their families on what they would consider the worst day of their life, literally. And so after 20 years of doing that, I became keenly aware that I personally had every symptom of burnout myself. And let me assure you that that is not a good place to be. But the what was the reason why I found that to be the most pressing problem of our time through my lens of experience in my little corner of the world and scope of influence was because as I looked around, there was an epidemic of burnout among healthcare workers. And so what I was taught in medical school, by the way, was this. And as you mentioned, I'm a research nerd. So what was I supposed to do in going through burnout? So I literally, this is how nerdy I am. I literally looked it up, right? I went to PubMed, PubMed is like Google for the health sciences. And, the conventional thinking at the time was, get away more, take more vacations and more nature hikes and do your meditation app and like all that stuff. And that's fine. But I wasn't buying it because that to me was escapism. Like if I could just get away from the ICU, get away from my patients as much as possible, everything would be fine. And like good cheer would magically replace it. Right. And that just didn't compute for me. I thought that something fundamentally had to change at the point of care. And that is when I became aware of the evidence that compassion is a powerful, beneficial therapy for the giver too, for the giver. And it's actually very different from what I was taught in medical school. So what I was taught in medical school, I distinctly remember this. So this was the early 90s. And and when I speak of this, and if I have physicians in the audience who have some gray hair like me, they often nod because they had this same experience. I remember being taught, don't care too much, because too much caring, too much compassion burns you out. And Suzanne, I believed that dogma without ever questioning it for 25 years until I was in the throes of burnout myself. And I went to the available evidence, and imagine my surprise when I found that where opinion and once reigned conjecture. Now there was actually bona fide research. And what the research shows quite clearly is there is an association between compassion and burnout. And this isn't just in healthcare, but just broadly across psychology and multiple different interdisciplinary scientific domains. There is, in fact, an association, but it's inverse. it's inverse. So if what I was taught in medical school was true, high compassion, high burnout, and low compassion, low burnout, but what the evidence supports is inverse, high compassion, low burnout, low burnout, high compassion. And why? What our research over the last 5 years, essentially, if there's one thing we learned, it's that the key to resilience is relationships. And so if you care deeply about patients and their families, or also like the staff, the nurses I had worked with in the ICU for at that time, 15 years, and even at home, and leaning in rather than pulling back and detaching, and caring more, not less, and doing it very much as an intentional practice, I had these deepening of these relationships that flowed from that. And that was when the fog of burnout began to lift for me. And so I basically did what I call my N of 1 experiment. I was the only study subject in the experiment, and it changed everything for me.
So you describe sort of your own medical education as really being the opposite of this, right? So don't care too much. When you're feeling stressed, need to recharge, step back. This seems pretty consistent with current ways of engaging in lots of professions, right? You know, sort of use meditation, use time off, this notion of self-care. To what extent is your way of thinking sort of part of a wave of others thinking in these terms? I still think it seems like we're in the middle of a huge burnout crisis with physicians, but really burnout across a variety of professions. And the recipe still is pull back, take time. I'd also say in my own work, which is with refugees in the humanitarian sector, there's all kinds of talk now about post-secondary trauma, which again says, don't care too much. You can't overly invest, step away. And what you're prescribing is care more, lean in more, embrace. How's that been received, within the medical profession? And do you see that spilling over elsewhere?
Thanks for the question. You know, one thing I want to acknowledge, first of all, is that burnout is something that has been studied the most among healthcare workers. And so sometimes people equate, burnout, that's that thing in healthcare workers, but it's not. It's a syndrome that has been described in people's with many different backgrounds, not just the helping professions, but it's only because those are the fields in which it's been studied. So I want to be clear by saying that you don't have to be a healthcare worker. You don't have to be in a helping profession. You don't have to be any of those things to feel burned out, especially in 2022 after a couple years of a pandemic. So I just want to say that loud and clear. And the reason why I think it's important to say that is to validate what so many people are feeling, but also that the data that we've gleaned in our 2 different projects here really applies to anybody anywhere, and it's not just a healthcare thing. So your question, how has this message been received? So I try to practice evidence-based medicine every day that I practice in the ICU. Similarly, my approach to all of my work, including my research, is again to be evidence-based. And what we did in our work, both in healthcare workers and then ultimately for the general population, is to examine the science. So we're talking about a quasi-systematic review of more than 1,000 scientific abstracts, over 250 original science publications in peer-reviewed journals are in each of the 2 books that you mentioned at the beginning. And so when you ask me how is it received, what I often tell people is that what I'm sharing with you isn't what I think, it's not what I believe, and I'm certainly not preaching to anybody. I'm just sharing with you what we found in a journey through the scientific evidence.
So, as with a lot of science, norms, perceptions, often run counter to that. And when you talk about something like burnout, there's really a sense that one needs to retreat. How is it that in your thinking, you get beyond those narratives that reference self-care, stepping back, exploring nature, right? Removing yourself from the situation. How do you think one interrupts that in practice? Certainly, I think in both of your books, it's a crazy, crazy compelling case. But in Common Conversation, it's not how people over the past 20 years have thought about burnout, have thought about stress, have thought about how you create a sense of resilience.
So really what the literature, the scientific literature that is, points to is deep, meaningful relationships. Again, I think I said this earlier, the key to resilience is relationships. That's what the science points to, and we get that through more connection, not through less. That being said, there is an important, and I don't intend this to be some sort of a disclaimer or anything like that, because I think that the hypothesis is that compelling, it is supported by science. There is, and actually Brene Brown said this one time in a 60 Minutes episode, the most compassionate people she had ever met all had one thing in common, and it was this: it was boundaries. And it was not that one would have limits for their compassion for others, but they were very clear with the people that they were serving or the people around them what was okay and what was not okay. And it is because setting boundaries is what makes compassion, for the most compassionate people, it is what makes it sustainable. So by setting boundaries, they're not being less compassionate. They're actually just setting boundaries so that they can be more compassionate. But if you, and Adam Grant and others have talked about this, you have to have some measure of self-interest in order to organize your life so that you're not just constantly flooded with either people walking on you like a doormat, right? Or that you're not taking care of yourself in such a way that you're in good health, both physically and mentally, to keep giving and serving.
Great. So 2 questions about this notion of boundaries. So I like this idea that, right, the boundaries enable you to be kind of all in and actually amplify the level of compassion. Is the boundary about what I would think of as scope conditions? So as an intensivist, you were, as you say, with people on the worst days of their life. And so it's about maximizing the compassion there and then transitioning to spaces, I don't want to say where you don't have compassion, but where the compassion isn't such a focal point of your work, or is it a boundary around who is the subject of your compassion? Like, how does that boundary operate, if you will?
So when I'm working clinically in the ICU, there's some pretty heavy stuff that goes on in there. And that's very different than what I would say my day-to-day experiences when I'm not working clinically in the ICU. I'm the chair of the Department of Medicine, so I have about 300 faculty. I don't practice nearly as much as I used to in terms of taking care of patients in the ICU, but it's very different than the day-to-day opportunities. Like I don't, in a day when I'm not working clinically, I have very different opportunities. But it reminds me of some data, a study from the University of Toronto, which found that in everyday life, so not intensivists, not ICU nurses, and just in everyday life, regular people on average have 9 empathy opportunities per day. And the reason why that is so important to me is that it's not hard to find them when I'm in the ICU. What I'm more likely to miss is the days I'm not working in the ICU, right?
Yep.
And the people around me, whether it's just in everyday life. And so it's a different mode, I think, but I actually have to more intentionally look for them when I'm not working clinically, because then they're just so obvious and present.
Right. So it's sort of a fascinating study. 9. I'm trying to think if I had one yet today.
Well, I think of it differently. How many did I miss already this morning? Right.
Yeah. No,
And
that's
can, now that if being honest, I can actually think of a couple where I could have done better.
It's interesting.
But yeah.
So is compassion something you get better at? So is the self-reflective attention you have to compassion, say in the ICU, something that makes you more compassionate with those 300 faculty?
Yeah. So I did not believe when I first started on this journey, probably 5+ years ago now, that that compassion was something that you could get better at. I believe that it's either something in your DNA or it's not, like in the fabric of who you are. And to be fair, that researchers in that space indicate that probably almost up to a third of one's propensity, if you will, to be compassionate and to always be looking to serve others is in fact somehow in our genes or gene expression, but that means that the vast majority is not. And what the research shows, not just in healthcare, but just broadly across all sorts of interdisciplinary scientific domains, it shows quite clearly that compassionate behaviors can, in fact, be learned. So the operative word there is behavior, not necessarily what you think in your mind or feel in your heart, but how you behave towards another person in a way that they can perceive it. And the research shows quite clearly that change is possible. And it wasn't until, I didn't say this at the beginning, Suzanne, I need to say this. I need everybody that's joining us today to know that I am very much a work in progress, very much. But the difference is that I see it now, and specifically I see the evidence that change is possible. I've reviewed these data. And because I'm now aware of that, and I should also say that, there's this concept in education, I think popularized most by the research of Dr. Carol Dweck and others, that growth mindset is possible. You have to believe that change is possible, because if you have a fixed mindset instead of a growth mindset, and you believe it's, I'm just not that way, I'm not touchy feely, I'm not a, one of those people. The research, because Dr. Dweck and colleagues, many people don't know this. They've actually studied this for compassion as well. And the key is believing that you can actually change and get better at something. And in my case, now that I've seen all the evidence that change is possible, that I can in fact get better at it, but I don't get it right all the time. It's like I practice that just like I practice medicine. But now, because I see it, like when I'm working in the ICU, in addition to working on my skills at putting in breathing tubes and catheters in the bloodstream and all these things, I'm also aware of the fact that I can get better at compassion. And that's why I work at that now, and I work at teaching my trainees, interns, med students, residents, fellows, teaching them that this is actually something that you need to believe you can get better at, or you won't. And what Dr. Dweck's work has shown is that the people who believe they can get better will actually be able to show compassion when compassion is hard. And let's face it, sometimes compassion is hard.
And so is it your sense, and is it the sense of the literature, that even folks who are introverts can do this? Folks who are not comfortable being expressive, is it something that they can get beyond if they have that growth mindset?
So I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that change is possible for everybody, just like there may be some more or less propensity in, like our makeup. There's probably people who are responders versus, a smaller, effect, if you will. But what there's a scientist who happens to also be a Buddhist monk by the name of Matthew Ricard, and he describes it this way. So this is his description. He says, if you were trying to throw the javelin, like in the track and field, right? Mm-hmm. No matter how bad or how good you were, just sort of intrinsically at doing that, or in your athleticism, you could get a little bit better every day. Right. Even if it's just an inch or a foot, but it will in fact go a little bit farther every day. And so some people start at different positions, but what the preponderance of evidence, and so again, this isn't like just what I think, but what the research shows is that on average, people can in fact get better.
Right. You've noted a couple of times in different fora that there's often an excuse, I don't have time to be compassionate. And I think of the other one that I sometimes hear, I'm too tired to be compassionate, right? That it takes an energy. Can you respond to that?
Sure. So the second one that you referred to might have to do with boundaries. Like if we're not doing self-care to a point where we can be an effective giver, right? That I can understand that. I would also say on the contrary, most people who are very effective givers, or in the sense of for compassion, the most compassionate people will describe it as an energizing thing. And so they're energized by giving and serving and building those relationships. So sometimes if you think, well, I'm just too tired for it, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right, where you don't have the relationships and the connections that can actually energize you.
So a bit like working out.
Yeah, maybe. I think that's a fair analogy. The other thing you asked me about was time. And so there is some research that I think is really important in this respect. And first of all, here was the most striking number we've come across, whether it was Compassionomics or a newer project, but 56. So 56, that's the proportion of physicians, according to a Journal of General Internal Medicine study from several years back now. That's a proportion of physicians who said that they don't have time to treat patients with compassion. That's a striking number, but it begs the question, how much time does it actually take? And so just real quickly, there was a Johns Hopkins study from years back now that really went right to the heart of this. And they enrolled in an experimental study, so randomized interventional trial, in nearly 300 patients, the vast majority of whom were survivors of breast cancer. And the primary outcome measure for this study was a validated scale of patients' anxiety. And for those people that are in the audience today, if you've ever had cancer or someone close to you has had cancer, anxiety is a pretty important outcome measure. And so in an experimental way, they tested an intervention, what they called the enhanced compassion intervention. So the control group was a standard information-only consultation with an oncologist. And what they found is that the enhanced compassion intervention reduced anxiety to an amount that was statistically significant, not only measurable, but statistically significant. And the intervention was literally just this from the oncologist. I know this is a tough experience for you to go through, and I want you to know that I'm here with you. If there's anything that I say to you today that's confusing or doesn't make sense, I want you to feel comfortable in stopping me. And most of all, I want you to know that we are in this together, and we'll go through this together. And then at the end of that consultation, the oncologist again said, I know this is a tough time for you, and I want to emphasize again that we're in this together. I will be with you each step along the way. And they measured how long that took. It was 40 seconds. So if we want to be evidence-based, about it, that study shows that you can have a meaningful connection that literally is associated with a reduction in anxiety levels among cancer survivors. And it only took 40 seconds. So some of my colleagues, I need to tell you, some of my colleagues bristle when I talk about this, because they say that there should be no time dimension at all. You can go through your day with brusque efficiency, like letting everybody know just how busy you think you are, or you can treat people with kindness and compassion. And if they held a stopwatch to you, it wouldn't be any different.
Mm-hmm. Huh. So I want to pivot a little bit between your first and second books, right? Because one of the things I find super interesting is that having compassion has benefits to you. And you talked about your study of one. So can you talk a little bit about the implications of kindness and compassion and serving others for one's well-being, one's happiness, one's sense of resilience in the world?
Totally. So one thing I need to remember to say that the benefits for yourself aren't the why, right? They're not the reason. They're not the reason to serve others. But I like to think of them as an unintended consequence or a byproduct or side effect, if you will. And the reason why I say that, again, is evidence-based, because what the research shows, and this is some of the most fascinating research that we've found in our most recent project, it shows quite clearly that motives matter. So there's this idea of like strategic helping, which isn't what we call live to give. It's like give to get, it's like, I'm going to do this service or kindness for others, and I think this is going to come back to me in like a boomerang or a pay it forward or karma or something like that. And what we found is that the live to give approach is when it is genuine, when it is from the right motives. It's not transactional, but rather it's transformational. And there are multiple mechanisms behind this. We probably don't have time for them today, but in short, serving others actually activates a distinct neural structure in your brain that is a reward center. Now, we all know this experientially, that it feels good to help people. So that's part of the physiology, but there are 4 different, what we call the Fantastic Four neurohormones, serotonin, oxytocin, dopamine, and endorphins, that are also responsible for why it feels good to help people, but also these have other physiological effects. Serving others fine-tunes the nervous system. So rather than amping up the sympathetic nervous system, which is like the fight or flight response, which is associated with all, if chronic and sustained over time, can have all sorts of bad effects on you physiologically. But it instead amplifies the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming, chill part of the nervous system. And really what all these things in total do is they not only reduce one's stress, but they also, research also shows that it can reduce the risk that or the effect that chronic stress has on early mortality. And then lastly, Barbara Fredrickson, who's at the University of North Carolina, did some research to show that actually eudaimonic, like serving a higher purpose sort of activities, changes one's gene expression and reduces the gene expression associated with systemic inflammation in the body. And if you have chronic systemic inflammation sustained over time, it's associated with all kinds of bad things like heart disease and cancer. And so there are real bona fide, mechanisms of action. But what we found is that, just to summarize, there's better physical health associated with people who are what we call live to givers. There's better mental health in those people, as well as more happiness, fulfillment, and well-being, even more professional success.
Mhm. So one of the things I think is super important in all of this research is your distinction between the sort of live to give and the give to get populations, right?
Yeah.
And certainly as a center that's known for community engaged work, working with lots of students who across the country are being told it's now a requirement to serve others in a variety of capacities. Is there a way to pivot that way of understanding? Because it's much more the give to get, check the box, move on.
That's right.
And how would you suggest we cultivate a different approach to this?
So what the preponderance of evidence in the scientific literature supports is that it is the fulfillment we get from it when we talk about having purpose in life. I mean, most people don't talk about like, snorkeling and daiquiris and like, vacation stuff, because that's not purpose. That's like stuff you do for fun. Right. But usually when people talk about their purpose in life, more often than not, they're talking about doing something that is serving others. And what research shows quite clearly is that those people who have the highest purpose in life have lower mortality risk on average over time. Yep. It's not only been shown for mortality risk, it's also been shown in a variety of different bad health conditions that can lead to one's mortality risk. And so I want to be, clear that it is serving others is hard work. I mean, of course, you all in the Center for Social Concerns know that. You don't always feel super happy when you're doing it, because you might just feel completely wrung out, because it's just such hard work. But if you have a long enough time horizon, and again, it's about the relationships that flow from that type of work. You are more likely to have those fulfilling relationships, but you're also more likely to be fulfilled in your work, having a higher sense of purpose. People define these words differently, but I think of joy as something that is associated with serving others. And joy isn't always like, happy, it's more of a deeper sense. The word that we typically use it's more transcendent, as opposed to just happiness, which is just a dopamine hit, which you can get from video games or chocolate cake. And it's the joy of serving others that is the transcendent experience. And again, it's research, not my belief, that supports that on average, that is good for you. And so that's what we did in our second book. Our first book was focused on the healthcare community. Our second book was focused on anybody everywhere. And the way we pivoted that work is because when we did all the research in burnout, and I essentially, for me, like compassion for others and the relationships that flowed from that was like an antidote to burnout. And we got letters, we got emails and messages from healthcare workers all over that said, hey, I tried that and I got the same results. And that's when Dr. Maz, it's Anthony Mazzarelli, my colleague and co-author, that's when we got to thinking, now this can't just be a true thing for people who wake up in the morning and put on scrubs and, go to work in a hospital. There must be something, a common thread, or maybe even a universal. And that's when we uncovered all the evidence in Wonder Drug, which is basically, we call it the scientific evidence that serving others is the best medicine for yourself, because that's what the evidence points to. Great.
So a couple of things in that description. So one, I really love the distinction between happiness and joy, and that seems important. And also the connection to purpose, right? Because I do think there's all kinds of evidence that says when you have a strong sense of purpose, you're happier, healthier, and better at what you do. Is is part of what's happening, though, in the medical profession, which I think historically people thought of as a calling, as a vocation, that it ceased a bit to be that. And so even in that population that we historically, at least from the outside, thought had strong purpose, needed to have this expression of compassion or kind of reevaluate the sense of serving within that to really fulfill that sense of purpose and joy?
So there is evidence of a compassion crisis in healthcare, but there's also evidence of a compassion crisis in society. And perhaps it's just spilling over. I mean, you and I could probably talk about that for an hour. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, so to speak. But I think it has also affected healthcare in some way. One thing that I think is important, Adam Grant studied this in a different helping profession. He studied it, and he and his colleagues studied it in firefighters. Mm-hmm. And what they found was that in the throes of whatever they were dealing with that day, whether it was, supporting paramedics and medical calls or going on, fighting fires, they didn't feel great in the moment, because that's super hard work. But what they found was that at the end of the day, right, perhaps right before they go to bed, as they're looking back at their day and everything they were able to do that was meaningful to try to help and serve other people, that's when they got their hit of, whatever, neurotransmitter, you want to plug in there that gave them that sense of that they've accomplished something that meant something to somebody. And, that's probably not like a happy sort of giddy moment. It's more of a transcendent sort of joy, like a job well done.
Great. I want to pivot now to a conversation about medical training, whether it's sort of pre-med training or medical training. And some of the questions that are queuing up furiously are addressing these. So maybe we can start with one of those. You said that when you were in medical school in the 1990s, the prevailing wisdom was that caring too much would burn you out. You're obviously working to combat that narrative, but do you have a sense of how medical schools teach about this today? Are medical schools catching up on that compassion and that can help prevent burnout? So what's your assessment of the landscape? What's working, what doesn't, and what do you do?
So here at our medical school, which is Cooper Medical School of Rowan University, we're in Camden, New Jersey. We're one of the newest medical schools in the US. We're just 10 years old. And we have a Center for Humanism that is working hard every day to make sure that the concepts that you and I just talked about for the last 40 minutes are ingrained into everything that we do. And again, not because it's the right thing to do. And it is, of course, right? What we were really asking in our initial work in healthcare workers, we were asking the question, does compassion really matter, right? And you might say, well, of course, compassion matters. It's the cornerstone of the art of medicine. And of course, everyone would agree with that, but that's not the question. Is it just in the art of medicine, or are there also evidence-based effects belong in the science of medicine? And what's the evidence? So what we try to do is curate, because we didn't generate these studies, we curated them, and they were published over many decades. What we did is curate them in such a way that it's very easily accessible, but to try to using the evidence to show that compassion in healthcare, compassion for patients belongs in the domain of evidence-based medicine. Mm-hmm. And in medical schools, we are all supposed to be teaching our students evidence-based medicine. And so I don't personally see this as being any different. And I think it might help make it might actually help our learners quite a bit, because what the research shows is that in the third year of medical school, that's when one's empathy, I don't know if we talked about this, empathy is sort of the sensing, feeling, detecting, and understanding component, but then compassion is going beyond that to help and alleviate one's pain and suffering to whatever extent is possible. Of course, empathy is important because you'll miss every opportunity for compassion, but if you don't have empathy, but we'd like to describe it like this because it's easy. Empathy plus action equals compassion.
Mhm.
And here at our medical school and others, we're trying to put this in the domain of evidence-based medicine because they are at a very vulnerable stage when they enter medical school. It's a pivotal time in their training, really.
So maybe you could just flesh out a smidge on this. So two things. I've read some studies that say empathy actually decreases in medical school for some students. And so are there particular interventions for you at Cooper Medical Center? And to what extent are your 300 faculty totally behind the compassion bandwagon and really creating a community that emphasizes that in your particular space?
So, first of all, I need to say that, there's this concept in medical training of the hidden curriculum, and it's not exclusive to medical training.
Yep.
But you don't find it in, textbooks. It's what you learn through socialization. And that's exactly what happened to me when I shared with you the story. When I was in the early 90s in med school, I was taught, don't care too much. Well, you wouldn't find that in any book or, or research paper. So it's really the hidden curriculum. And so over the last, 4 decades or so, I think the hidden curriculum has done quite a bit of damage and propagated a lot of untruths about compassion for patients and, compassion for each other for that matter. But if we want to be evidence-based, compassion belongs in that domain. And so when I hear more skeptical, and I should tell you before I say this, I'm fluent in sarcasm. So, if I hear, some sort of cynical, communication between one of my maybe upper level trainees and a, lower level trainee or a student, and, because I'm fluent in sarcasm, I might challenge that person. Like, do you prescribe leeches, in your practice? Because we don't do antiquated thinking around here, right? So take that cynicism and, go, take a break for a while and come back and think about this and then come back, because we only do evidence-based medicine around here. And that cynicism is antiquated and has got to go.
Got it. Great. Okay, next question. Healthcare providers can experience moral injury when they feel they are not able to provide the kind of care they think their patients deserve. Burnout, of course, can make this worse. Could you speak on the relationship between moral and injury in a healthcare context and burnout?
Sure. So, not to be too academic geeky about this, right? But there is, so the burnout syndrome as first described, as typically defined, has 3 distinct components. So one is emotional exhaustion. The second is depersonalization. So that's an inability or difficulty making personal connections. But then the third one is the feeling like you're not really making a difference. And so moral injury is something that has been popularized by an article in Stat News, I believe it was, a few years back. I really think this is just my opinion. I think that's just describing that component of the burnout syndrome, is the feeling like you're not really making a difference.
Great. So in this conversation series, last year, we had a conversation with Victor Montori, who has talked about these challenges in the context of modern medicine and the kind of bureaucratic rationale of the way things happen. And I wonder if you could speak a bit to that, because you mentioned sort of this, sort of social distance from the phenomenon, the lack of sense that there's any meaning or you have impact. And for him, a lot of this is the structure of modern commercial medicine.
Yep.
And no amount of education, training, evidence-based interventions is going to help that until we fix medicine, which is a pretty bold claim as well. What's your sense of that?
I agree. And that's why I'm spending an hour with you today talking about the importance of compassion, and the majority of the rest of my day, because I'm not practicing in the ICU today, most of the rest of my day will be focused on operations. Mm-hmm. And I can give you a concrete example of this, but if you have really bad operations, and when I talk about operations, I'm talking about also trying to strip out some of this, all these, not just inefficiencies, but moral injury types of experiences in healthcare, because typically when describing moral injury, they healthcare workers don't really connect with their patients like maybe they used to, or they think that they used to. So one thing that I say not infrequently is you can't care your way out of bad operations, right? Mm-hmm. And so, for example, if in one of my 26 primary care clinics in Southern New Jersey, patients have to wait extremely long periods of time because we don't have good operations in our office, well, that tells that patient that, whoever's in charge here doesn't care enough about their time to actually fix this. Right. And so you're starting off with just an insulting experience before you even sit down with the doctor. Right. So similarly, and this is an important one for right now, I think, electronic health records, 100% electronic health records save people's lives every day. That said, there are unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences is research shows quite clearly that healthcare providers spend more time now looking into computer screens than looking their patients in the eyes. Mm-hmm. Looking what I call eyeball time, like that is critically important for the quality of care. Because patients, if you think about it, especially if they're facing, some sort of condition that maybe has stigma associated with it, they're telling the doctor some of their most personal, deepest, closely held things. And if the doctor doesn't even look them in the eyes, are they really going to divulge what's really going on? Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That maybe they're struggling with addiction, or they're just been so depressed that they just, can't get out of bed. And, if you don't have that connection, research shows quite clearly that when patients feel like their doctors are not paying attention to them, they're not even listening to the discharge instructions. Mm-hmm. Research also shows that when patients feel cared for, like their doctor knows them as a person, they're more likely to take their medicine. They're more likely to follow their discharge instructions. And so the reason why I'm telling you this is that it is my job, literally, to figure out how to get more of what I call eyeball time, so that we pick up on all these cues that are meaningful to people. And of course, better relationships will flow from that. And so what we're doing, like right now, as we sit here today in our primary care clinics, there is a technology. And by the way, don't ask me how it works because I have no idea, but it somehow can listen to the medical interview and write the note for the doctor. So all they have to do is edit and sign rather than typing into the computer. And I don't know how it differentiates chit chat about the Phillies game or from like, tell me about your symptoms, but somehow it does that. I don't know how, but it's my job literally to figure out how we can be better with human connection. And a lot of that is operations. And I know we're running short on time, but I do want to share with you, you asked me like how many people are all in my organization. Yep. Well, we recently revisited our core values for the organization. And we had before we had 10 core values. And if you have 10 core values, you actually have 0 because no one can remember them all, right? And so we decided that our core values, and this was after, and this wasn't just people in the C-suite deciding. This was on the ground at the point of care, asking people what they think it is that we stand for at Cooper. as well as getting voice of the customer from the consumers in our catchment area in Southern New Jersey. And ultimately, what we came to was 3 core values. And the 3 core values are this: compassion, inclusion, and excellence. And your core values are actually your core values when you're in a meeting making, you're in the room to make decisions about which way are we going to take the organization, and leaders are not only feeling comfortable, but also encouraged to ask colleagues with a difference of opinion, well, how does your suggestion relate to our 3 core values? And so at least at the organizational level, I think, and by the way, our work didn't do that, but what I think has happened is that our work has made people think about it. Anyway, I'll stop there.
So we have a number of questions and certainly not enough time for them all. So I just want to put them out there and see if, you could use this as part of a final word. So one of the questions is about the competitive nature of medical school, right? Getting into medical school, being successful in medical school reputations, residencies, et cetera. The next one is about if there are, in the literature on compassion, if there's literature around crises, so Katrina, 9/11, and has that given any sense of drivers around compassion? And then a final one is, sort of just, I'm not familiar with this kind of argument in medicine. Are people often surprised by it when you present the case for compassion in medical care? So dealer's choice or something else.
I can hit them. We got 2 minutes left. I think I can hit all 3 in 2 minutes.
Okay, excellent.
Okay. As far as the competitiveness, yeah, it's super competitive. Our medical school gets 6,000 applications for 120 spots. Sorry. I mean, that's just, it is that competitive. And I do think that, so first of all, the holistic aspects, like a lot of things we've been talking about, do matter. Now, they only matter for those who score above a certain level on standardized exams like the MCAT. So that's just the reality. Number 2 was asking really about catastrophe compassion, and that's a term, I didn't generate that term. It comes from Stanford's Jamil Zaki, who's written a paper about this. But what research shows is that in general, when catastrophe strikes, people bond together. In general, the one exception, by the way, historically has been pandemics. And it's, you can kind of get why that happens, is because people are, kind of scared of each other, right? But I saw a lot of examples of catastrophe compassion. There's a term called elevation. That's the emotional uplift you feel when you bear witness to heroism and moral excellence. And there's just a lot of elevation that I felt from this pandemic, and I think that's a form of catastrophe compassion. The last thing that I'll share, and the question was, do people really, are they surprised by this? Well, Dr. Maz and I, what we like to do is we like to look at familiar things in perhaps an unfamiliar way. And so the familiar thing in Compassionomics was compassion in healthcare. The familiar thing in Wonder Drug was kindness and serving others. But we like to look at familiar things in an unfamiliar way, and specifically not through like a moral ethical lens or an emotional sentimental lens, but rather through the lens of science. And if you examine the available evidence rigorously enough, you'll find that things that you typically only thought of in a qualitative domain can actually be examined in a quantitative way. So that's what we're trying to do. So, but yeah, some people are surprised, but if you look at the evidence, we don't, and this is the last thing I'll tell you, we're not trying to change anybody's heart in any of this work. We're just trying to change your mind. Like if you change your mind to see that compassion in healthcare or kindness and serving others from the general population, that these things matter not just in meaningful ways, but also in measurable ways.
Great. And with that, I just want to thank you so much for spending this hour with us. I think we could go on and on forever. I think for anybody interested, both Compassionomics and Wonder Drug are this really fabulous, super easily accessible sort of research, evidence-based set of arguments about compassion and kindness. So thank you so much for this. And thank you all for spending the lunch hour with us. Please join us Monday, December 5th for a conversation with educator Anika Pranther on education and liberation. So Stephen, thank you. This has been a whole lot of fun.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
And I hope to see you on campus sometime soon.
Me too.